hostile to the SNP in general, they reacted a lot to the idea that compassion was a Scottish value, as if that was somehow an outrageous thing to suggest that anybody has any different values. They seem to sort of take it to be a distinction. Well, there was I don't know how you call that, but I think you get that kind of thing quite a lot actually in the debate, and hostility to anything which smacks of that at all.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair appraisal of it. There is a certain kind of, would you be fair to describe it almost as a groupthink that kind of develops around this kind of discussion?
Which one? Sorry, in what sense?
Just around, say, like the idea of compassion as a particularly Scottish value, or kind of similar ideas around Scottish values.
Well, because again, it's another kind of controversial phrase, because some people would use it, I think, quite thoughtlessly and say, usually it's a particular claim about a kind of Scottishness which is wanted to be promoted, whether that's kind of a lefty, slightly more social democratic Scottishness. It's just the reaction to it that I find quite interesting. That kind of narrative about Scotland promotes such a kind of negative response from some quarters, whereas actually the similar kind of arguments that you might get about today's Britain, all about fair play and so forth, they don't seem to attract quite the same level of anxiety from those that are maybe a bit less convinced about the whole independence prospect.
Yeah, it seems almost banned at times to say something positive about the Scottish character. How dare? Yeah, I agree with what you're saying, Andrew.
I was having this discussion with somebody the other day where I felt like, I guess the point I was trying to make is that we've, this idea, this narrative of Scottishness around Scottish values, which are kind of, I guess, are seen as contemporary politics more left of centre, around, kind of social solidarity, around kind of a certain dispensation towards the state, things like that. That's been very heavily critiqued recently. It's a very popular thing to say that this idea of Scottishness is too overarching. It's not representative. And I think that's fair. Not everyone does believe in this, and this idea of a pure social democratic consensus has been overplayed. But by the same token, there is some attitudes, and I'm not saying distinctively Scottish, but they are quite prevalent in Scottish society, and it does represent the way we vote and things like that. So I feel that in undermining the narrative so much, we've actually lost some of the narrative that might have some truth to it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and I think, and again, to be boring and consistent and thematic, I think there's another aspect of that which goes back to this unionism point, that actually if you were a kind of devoted unionist of the old fashion that sees Scotland and the rest of the UK and England and Wales and whatever as being a kind of union of different countries, then presumably it shouldn't be too controversial to sort of say, well, yes, there are kind of distinctiveness that makes it kind of positive, potentially a kind of bringing new aspects to the whole British table from different parts of the country. And so to insist on that everyone in Britain's essentially the same, that everyone, for example, the desperate attempts to talk up UKIP in Aberdeen and to say, no, actually Scots are just as Eurosceptic as the English, despite the polling evidence, to say that actually we're going to have more, sort of the hostility towards welfare is just the same, despite the fact that the evidence doesn't seem to bear that out and the politics doesn't bear that out. It seems a very kind of curious sort of attitude to me to kind of be desperate to sort of insist on uniformity, and maybe that reflects this sort of contemporary unionism which tends more ironically towards uniformity in an age when actually we've seen the emergence of devolution. How's that for an odd historical irony?
I guess underpinning that is what's underpinning a lot of politics that we're seeing around Europe is that the real issue probably of a separate state emerging isn't actually emerging in Scotland, it's emerging in the southeast of England.
Yeah.
And a separate identity and a separate political dispensation. There's a very interesting article in the latest issue of The New Yorker, name dropping, by John Lanchester, basically arguing that 1979 was the pivotal political year of the last 50 years, not 1989. And I do think that there is a lot of truth in that, and that post-Thatcherite political landscape that we're still living in has had a far greater effect. Its reaction in Scotland has been reaction against it, but in terms of actual reaction with it and what's the kind of social economic foundations for it, it has been far more advanced in the southeast of England than they have in other places. And if you look at this whole move around UKIP, around Europe and things like that it is a far more driven from the southeast of England, and I think you could almost make an argument that that's where the real question around a separate state is actually cropping up, and it does pose a huge problem for unionism regardless of Scottish independence. I think there is systemic issues around the United Kingdom now that are becoming more pronounced. And as we come out of this recession, which we're still nowhere near out of, the unevenness of what economic growth we have 5 years after 2008 is going to be accentuated in the coming years, and I think that is going to only increase these divisive tendencies. And I think it's going to be a huge question for unionism, regardless of 2014, is how do you deal with this? How do you knit a polity back together that does feel like it's becoming increasingly isolated from one another?
Yeah, and in lots of different ways. I mean, one of the other examples is the state of the current Conservative Party and its basic sort of abandonment of the North as in political terms, in terms of electoral politics. They're just the sense that we're never going to win there, never going to win in Scotland, so just had to kind of stick below the, sort of, I don't know what the Cameronian wall, one could call it, or something like that. And about these divisions across the country that become sort of unanswerable, and there's no sort of narrative, there's no story which really holds it together. It's just sort of the weight of inertia. Certainly no positive story. That's what I always think is kind of problematic about the whole devolution thing, that we really don't have a politically stabilizing story to tell, a project in these islands, because devolution, with its lopsidedness and its selectivity and its sort of differential levels of power based on different demands, it isn't actually moving us towards a more stable, better governed sort of country.
I think this is what the independence project is. If you look at some of the debates, although again not necessarily in the main one, if you look at even the guest from Business for Indy supporting the Reed Foundation and the Commonwealth, and a lot of the different initiatives and the different groups going on around the country, even if it's not in the mainstream, these debates are going on, and this is the big political project in these islands. The re-establishing an old independent nation and making it better, making it a different narrative. I think that is the big political project in the United Kingdom at the moment. Finishing it.
No, and equally, of course, in line with what Peter was saying, one way to actually remove at least one of the challenges facing contemporary unionism is for us to become independent. That makes it actually much easier in some ways to have a conversation in Britain, at least without having sort of to deal with Scottish distinctiveness. Then, of course, you'd have to confront the sort of England's problem and its imbalances, which I think are kind of long deferred and aren't really being addressed at all. I suppose actually that maybe that's a much harder sort of conversation, but maybe a better one in our absence, maybe a clearer sighted one. Anyway, since that shut you both up. Okay, well, thanks for coming back on the show, Peter. It's always nice to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Not at all. And we'll be back probably next week, and I'll be back actually broadcasting from Scotland this time round, as I'm moving back to Glasgow on Sunday, which is a perilous venture. So I will be a kind of proper Scottish nationalist who actually lives in the country now. Wouldn't that be a novelty? So I'll see you all then, and see you then, Michael, as well. See you later.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Changes. Turn and face the strain. Changes. Don't wanna be a richer man. Changes. Turn and face the strain. Changes. It's gonna have to be a different man. Time may change me, but I can't trace time.
Do you want me to come in?
Yes, please do.
Yes.
Darkness there.
Sorry, I had my mute.
Sorry.